So it gives you some overall description of what a policy memo is. The biggest difference between a policy memo and a management memo is a management memo gives direction and a policy memo gives advice. And the policy, so therefore it's not telling you exactly what to do, it's explaining while you give a recommendation why that's the logical course of action to take. And this is the overall memo format that typically follows for a policy memo. There can be deviations of this. The big thing is to make sure you have headings and subheadings to help guide the reader. This is a common mistake made by first-time policy memo writers. They don't have any structure to the memo, and that makes it really hard to follow. And if there's one thing that you will practice is writing concisely and effectively in this class. It is 3 pages. There was a typo in the previous memo guidelines that said a 2-page limit here. I have since changed that. That was a previous requirement that I updated based on just reality, that writing a 2-page memo is a very polished skill that you all I don't expect to be at the end of this semester, so we're going to stick to 3. That's hard enough, writing 3 single-spaced pages policy memo. It will follow the memo format where in the structure, the to, from, date, and subject. Now, I want you to think about the author here, who you are actually writing to. Your audience. I should say not the author, your audience. Your client. Who would be a prospective client? It's not me. I am the one grading it, but I want you to think about who you would actually be writing this memo to, and do that for every case. The main points about content, you really want to think about, and this is why it's important to know your audience, because that kind of dictates the type and the amount of background material you will give. It will depend on, how layman you write. And then you really want to make sure that you're presenting ideas very clearly. You articulate your points in a logical way that makes sense and it's easy to follow. Definitely be using evidence to support your recommendation. And the other big tip is your recommendation should go about solving the problem that you defined. And that's a really important part here. So let's look at some, and we'll start with one that was not so good. I removed the names to protect their privacy. But first of all, it's to me, not to an actual prospective client. The subject is just simply the case name. Please get more creative than that. And have also your subject tailored to the tone of your memo. It has a summary here, and then, well, I'm fine with numerated lists. This is not a good one because all it does is list the problems, and it wouldn't be the place that this would belong anyway. It's better if you're enumerating things that you will discuss. That could be like subheadings, like you could enumerate the policy alternatives that you evaluated. So as you can see, there's no real good formatting, and it's all actually, this whole memo is very kind of all over the place. It's not well organized, and that makes it hard to read. And there's just basic, writing mistakes, like starting 2 paragraphs with the very same words. That's never a good idea. It lists a lot. There's no problem actually clearly defined, which then, again, reduces its ability to follow in a logic narrative because it's kind of all over the place. It identifies a lot of different, everything from leadership to physical dimensions. And so while it talks about lack of communication, lapse in technology, it doesn't really give any clear way to deal with these. And then, as you can see, there's no real conclusion. It just he just talks about the problems. So not a very good memo. Now let's look at 2 others that are well done. So they give a very likely client, recipient of this memo, right? The committee, the Senate committee that will actually be making a decision about reorganizing FEMA or doing something to improve emergency management response. It's a little bit better of a subject heading, but and in this case it's okay because of the way that the student defined the problem, and that is the United States is not prepared to handle major disasters. Now, this is a very large scope. It could be a little difficult to handle in a 3-page memo, but they do okay. They specifically point to this need for coordinated emergency management system, and that was my critique or a constructive criticism was this really the lack of a coordinated emergency management system is the problem, and it would have been a better problem statement because the student then goes in and describes what this entails, and it talks about the ability to have better communications and deployment of different emergency management responses, experience, leadership. The other thing I really like that the student did was they discussed the evaluative criteria. They talk about the 4 alternatives, they describe which ones they actually are going to be evaluating, and they describe the evaluative criteria here. And they describe how. First, they define the criteria, and then what specifically they're looking for in the different alternatives. And that's how it organized the analysis section was by the criteria. And then they have a really nice outcome matrix here where they have the different policy alternatives evaluated, and then they by the different criteria. And then each cell gives an assessment of how well this alternative fares against these 3 criteria. They used different color fonts. They bolded the ones that were the winners in that area. And then there's a clear recommendation that does address how the coordinated emergency management could be improved. So, nicely done. Another version that is a little bit more specific, this student actually went as far to give themselves a consultant name. But again, they sent it to a subcommittee, appropriate subcommittee, a good subject heading, very nice formatting, although they did a different style here. The analysis is set up, in this case, it's smaller, but it's done by the different alternatives, and that's a good way to go. Their problem here is very specific, though, and that's what makes this one a very good memo, is it's very pointed in that it's a communication system that they found to be the problem. And then, so the whole background goes to support why communication is vital. They give nice statistics from evidence, very good evidence from the text to support that problem statement. And then the analysis is really about how do you go about getting the reliable and efficient. And so they really focuses on this radio. That's what they believe to be the best things, but they do talk about how you could use cell phones and other types of alert systems. And then so ultimately, though, they recommend these radios, which their analysis kind of pointed them towards that being the solution. So there's evidence to support this recommendation. So I hope that helps give a little bit more guidance in rewriting it. So really try to zero in on a very specific slice of the problem. Make sure your background supports that definition. And then clearly describe in your evaluative criteria, and then go about either in your discussion of your analysis, you can organize it by, talking about each alternative and how, briefly into how they, one stood out in terms of faring the best against the evaluative criteria. Or you can look at the evaluative criteria and then narrowing in on which one you thought was the most important and why that specific alternative that you're recommending did the best.